For the next subject matter in this course, we have a two-part lecture series on the topic of acute muscular fatigue and the fundamental science of conditioning, often referred to as endurance training. So first, let's do a brief overview of basic terminology here. Acute muscular fatigue. What do you think this is referring to? We should all know by now the term acute simply refers to something that is immediate and temporary. So immediate and temporary muscular fatigue is the topic here. But what is a bit more complex is this term fatigue. Now, if I asked you what is muscular fatigue, most of you will simply say your muscles getting tired, like when you exercise hard. Not a bad answer, but not a technically sound answer. This term, acute muscular fatigue, in this lecture series and in exercise science, is used to describe a situation in which muscle contractions and therefore muscular force production are temporarily inhibited due to the presence of a stressor during heavy exercise or high to maximum intensity exercise. Now let me give you a practical example of acute muscular fatigue. When you perform a Wingate test, which many of you have performed in exercise physiology lab, you perform an all-out cycling sprint against a bit of resistance for 30 seconds straight. You initially accelerate and ramp up until you reach peak RPMs or peak power. Then what happens? No matter how fast or how hard you are trying to sprint, you are going to slow down. The RPMs and thus power output start to drop steadily or sometimes rapidly depending on the individual. And this usually starts to occur within about 5 seconds of this all-out effort test. So why does this occur? Why does the power output during this test eventually decline despite putting forth maximum effort? It's not because you want to decline the power output. You are trying to cycle as hard as you possibly can. It's because something is inhibiting your muscles from contracting and producing force at its maximum capability. Something is literally slowing you down. More specifically, quote unquote, slowing down the muscles, putting the brakes on the active muscles, in other words. This is an example of acute muscular fatigue. Here's another example. Imagine performing a set of loaded back squats. As you perform one rep after another, we all know what will eventually occur. We know that the movements will become slower and slower, and we can tell that our muscles are not putting out as much contractile force as it did on the first rep. This is again, despite the fact that you are trying as hard as possible to move that weight. Something is inhibiting the muscle from contracting as hard as you want it to. Eventually, you get to a rep where you could barely push the weight up. So the question is, what is inhibiting your muscles during these situations? And more importantly, why? So in other words, how does acute muscular fatigue work and why does it exist? These are the questions that we will answer in part 1 of this lecture series. Now, some of you may be wondering, isn't fatigue simple? Isn't it just muscles getting tired? No, it's not that simple, both in the mechanisms underlying fatigue and the biological reason as to why we experience fatigue when our muscles are working really, really hard. Some of you may believe that whenever your muscles fatigue, like during the sprint or during the set of back squats, it is simply because your muscles have ran out of fuel, and thus energy for muscle contractions are depleted. We will explain this further later, but no, that is not the reason why we fatigue, say during a sprint or a set of back squats. We have plenty of fuel in the tank after a single sprint, or even during the sprint. So running out of fuel is not what explains acute muscular fatigue and why we slow down during an all-out sprint or, say, a set of back squats. Some may even say it's because the muscle cannot provide enough ATP, which we all know is a cell's energy currency to power the muscle contractions. In other words, we run out of ATP. Nope, that is not the explanation for acute muscular fatigue. In fact, as I will discuss later, our muscles have the ability to meet ATP demands no matter how hard you are exercising. Even during that Wingate test, as your RPMs are declining due to fatigue, the muscle's ATP demands are being met. So what is the explanation then for acute muscular fatigue? Well, this is the fundamental question, as I said, that we must answer in this lecture series. And why is it important for us to understand acute muscular fatigue on a deeper scientific level? Why do we need to understand why at a certain level of muscular work or exercise intensity, we experience this muscle inhibition, this fatigue effect? The reason why it is important to understand fatigue is because fatigue is the most limiting factor to human performance. I'll say it again. The reason why it is important to understand fatigue is because fatigue, as described earlier, is the most limiting factor to human performance. Think about it from a sporting perspective. The major factor that influences how one performs during a match or game is fatigue. The athlete who may be a very fast sprinter or the quickest on a team, but fatigues easily, will have overall poor performance. In other words, it doesn't matter how fast you can run, it matters how long you can run fast. Now keep in mind, the importance of fatigue is not just relevant to sports settings. It's also for the everyday individual and even clinical or older populations. What is the major limiter to normal physical function other than, say, pain? It is fatigue. For example, if fatigue prevents one from being able to go up a full flight of stairs, well, that is going to be a major limiter to normal physical functioning. We see this often in the older adult populations. Now, many of you will be going into PT and OT, and I will say, after years of consulting and doing seminars for PTs and OTs, the common missing piece in rehab programs, as well as prehab programs, is dealing with fatigue. Many programs do not condition the patient so that they may perform more muscular work without fatigue. Many programs restore mobility and the ability for patients to perform certain movements, but in everyday life, certain movements are repeated over and over again, such as when you walk. So it's not just about getting a patient to be able to walk normally, but it's also about the patient being able to walk at a certain pace longer without fatigue, or being able to walk faster without fatigue for longer periods. Now, as you can see, fatigue is relative. Some may experience fatigue within 10 seconds of running 10 miles per hour, while another experiences the same level of fatigue walking 2 miles per hour. The fatigue is the same, but it can occur at different levels of muscular work depending on the individual. So the information we are presenting here has a lot of implications to human performance, not just in athletes and sport performance, but also in the general population and in the activities of daily living. The great thing about this topic is that no matter what field you are getting into, whether it is working with performance development in athletes or post-op rehabilitation of older adults, all of the upcoming information is applicable and relevant. Now, before getting into the topic of acute muscular fatigue, we need to go over some foundational information leading into this lecture series. So with that said, we will first do a good refresher on exercise bioenergetics, which was introduced in your exercise physiology course. Now, after this comprehensive refresher on exercise bioenergetics, I will discuss the role of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism during exercise and how both work in an integrative manner to meet the ATP demands of working muscles. I introduced this topic in exercise physiology, but here I will discuss this in much more advanced detail. And this is where we begin to understand the whys of fatigue. Now, going along with the topic of aerobic and anaerobic integration during exercise, we will discuss the topic of the anaerobic threshold and what it represents. We will discuss the environment of the muscle cells that are working below and above the anaerobic threshold. And we will focus largely on explaining why the post-anaerobic threshold, so exercise intensities above the anaerobic threshold, is where fatigue occurs. So in this section, we will explain why acute muscular fatigue occurs during these types of exercise. So what is that stressor that causes fatigue during exercise that is above the anaerobic threshold? Then, of course, a huge component of this lecture series will be on the mechanisms of acute muscular fatigue. This is the question of how acute muscular fatigue occurs. Then in part 2 of this lecture series, I will discuss the science of conditioning and the adaptations that result in one being able to produce more muscular work without fatigue. For example, before the conditioning program, an athlete can sustain a 12-mile-per-hour run for only 5 minutes due to fatigue. But after a month of conditioning, the athlete is now able to sustain 12 miles per hour for much longer because there is no fatigue. So in part 2, I will discuss what explains these improvements. So again, the science underlying conditioning. In addition, we will discuss how to achieve these improvements. So explain the question of how do we get to the point where we can do more muscular work with less fatigue. Again, this will be in part 2 of this lecture series. Alright, so like I said, we need to do a comprehensive refresher on exercise bioenergetics. Now, we won't go over all the different bioenergetic pathways, but we need to understand the fundamentals of exercise bioenergetics. Now, this is the foundation of everything we will be discussing with regards to acute muscular fatigue. So without understanding bioenergetics, at least fundamentally, it's really hard for you to understand acute muscular fatigue. Now, I use this figure in my exercise physiology course, and it may be familiar to some of you. And I use this to help students visualize the role of bioenergetics during exercise. This may or may not be familiar to you, but we will go over it regardless. So here we have what we call a reverse causal model, so a reverse cause and effect model. So here we will present the overall process, but in reverse. So we have the end point. The end point is exercise. We want to perform exercise movements such as the back squat shown in this animation. So let's ask some basic questions. In order for us to exercise and move, what needs to happen? Well, we know generally that muscle contractions need to happen. In order for us to move our body, we need specific muscles to contract to produce enough forces to generate joint actions. Here we have an example of a joint action called elbow flexion. In order for us to produce this elbow flexion, we need the biceps to contract and apply force on the bones of our limbs. Okay, so let's dissect this even further. In order for our muscles to contract, what needs to occur in our muscles? Now we have to go way back to our exercise physiology course. As we learned, muscles contract because inside muscle fibers, we have the myofilaments undergoing the sliding filament process. Remember, muscles shorten and lengthen during contractions because the myofilaments, the thick and thin myofilaments within each of the muscle fibers, they slide past one another. So let's dissect this even more. In order for the thick and thin filament to slide past one another to produce a muscle contraction to perform exercise, what needs to occur? Let's zoom in on these myofilaments. We know from our exercise physiology course that the thick and thin myofilaments need to physically interact with one another through a process called cross-bridge cycling. The myosin head attaches to the actin of the thin filament and slides it across. Now, if you remember the first lecture in exercise physiology, we discussed the requirements for cross-bridge cycling. We discussed how in order for the myosin head to connect to the thin filament, more specifically the actin on the thin filament, to do work on the thin filament, like sliding it across, it requires energy. And we discussed briefly that the energy comes from this little molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And the process by which the energy is released from ATP, we said, was referred to as ATP hydrolysis, which is essentially breaking up the ATP molecule to release the energy inside it. In other words, ATP is hydrolyzed. Now, more on this later in much more detail. Just for now, understand that ATP is an energy molecule, and through the process of ATP hydrolysis, it releases the energy to the myosin head so the myosin head can perform work on the thin filament, sliding it across to perform the sliding filament process for muscles to contract and for you to exercise. So with that being said, in order for cross-bridge cycling to occur, there needs to be ATP available. So just to recap, to perform exercise, we need muscle contractions. To contract muscles, the myofilaments need to slide across one another per the sliding filament theory. For the myofilaments to slide across one another, you need cross-bridge cycling. For cross-bridge cycling to occur, you need energy. The energy is derived from ATP and the breakup of ATP, which is again referred to as ATP hydrolysis. So here now we see ATP, and we know that ATP is the immediate source of energy for cross-bridge cycling. I also alluded to the fact that ATP is an intermediate fuel molecule, and that it holds energy for a very brief period of time, meaning once it is available, it will be hydrolyzed or broken apart. It doesn't just hang around, nor is it stored in the cell in high amounts. When we exercise, our muscle cells require a constant availability of energy, which means it needs a constant availability of ATP. Since ATP is not stored in high amounts, ATP must be constantly generated to meet the energy demand of the muscle cells during exercise. So where does this ATP come from? It comes from the transfer of energy from fuel molecules, and that whole process is called bioenergetics. So we have bioenergetic systems that serve to break down fuel molecules to release the energy from the fuel molecules to hold it temporarily in ATP. Through this process, you form ATP. So when energy is transferred from a fuel molecule to ATP, you form ATP. So essentially, bioenergetics is the process of generating ATP, energy released from fuel and temporarily held in ATP, thereby forming ATP. Now, bioenergetic systems can be generally categorized into two systems. We have the anaerobic system and the aerobic system, also referred to as the anaerobic metabolism and aerobic metabolism. Now, most of you, if I asked you what differentiates these two systems, you would say oxygen, and that is correct. The aerobic system breaks down fuel molecules to release energy to form ATP, which again holds that energy temporarily, and it does this with the help of oxygen. And this is the whole reason why we need oxygen to live. Aerobic ATP production is not just relevant to muscle, it is important for most cells in the body. So anaerobic metabolism involves the breakdown of fuel molecules, the release of energy from said fuel molecules, and the formation of ATP, which temporarily holds that energy without the need of oxygen. So this is an oxygen requiring ATP producing system, and this is a system that does not require oxygen to produce ATP. So the next question is, what are the fuel sources? What are the fuel molecules? The body's fuel sources are referred to as macronutrients. These comprise of carbohydrates, fat, and protein molecules, with carbohydrates and fats being the more utilized fuel sources. These molecules in their chemical bonds hold energy that can eventually be released. And like I said, through aerobic or anaerobic systems, the chemical bonds of these fuel molecules can be broken up and energy is released. Some of this energy is gone in the form of heat, and some of the energy is transferred and held inside the bonds of ATP. And as I said, this process results in the formation of ATP. So now just to recap, the ATP is then broken up through hydrolysis on the myosin head, releasing the energy to the myosin to produce cross-bridge cycling with a thin filament, which causes the sliding filament process, which causes muscle contractions, which allow for movement or exercise. Okay, so let's dissect this even further. Where do these fuel molecules come from? We have two sources for fuel. First, we have fuel stored inside various cells in the body within different organs. Fuel stored within the body is described as endogenous, endogenous, endo meaning inside. So there are fat, carbohydrate, and protein stores within various cells in the body. The major areas of fuel storage include the liver, adipose, and skeletal muscle. And we will discuss later in what forms these fuel molecules are stored as in these areas. But generally, the liver not only stores fuel, but also distributes fuel to other parts of the body. Adipose is mainly meant for fuel storage, largely in the form of fat molecules, which is why most people refer to adipose simply as fat. And muscle stores fuel in the form of all three, although protein is not favored as a fuel source. It is mostly carbohydrates and fats that muscle utilizes as fuel. Now the next question is, where do these endogenous fuel stores come from? Meaning, after they are used, how are they replenished? I think most of you know. It's by eating food that contains these fuel molecules. In food, you have fat, carbs, and protein molecules that you can consume. The digestive system will break down fat, carb, and protein molecules from food into smaller molecules. Large fat molecules are broken down into fatty acids, large carb molecules are broken down into glucose mainly, and proteins are broken down into its building blocks, amino acids. As it passes through the intestinal tract, these smaller molecules can be absorbed into blood circulation, and these fuel molecules can then be stored somewhere in the body, such as adipose, the liver, or muscle. So the fuel that is provided through food is described as exogenous, EXOGENOUS. Exo referring to outside the body. So we have exogenous and endogenous fuel sources. The exogenous fuel molecules replenish endogenous fuel stores, and these endogenous fuels are then utilized by cells like muscle cells for its energy and therefore ATP needs. And this is through, again, anaerobic and or aerobic metabolism, your bioenergetic systems. So before you move forward in this lecture series, you must be able to understand this overview, since this will allow you to visualize the bioenergetics during exercise. Now, everything on the left side of this red border are the direct processes underlying muscle contractions. It is the machinery involved in muscle contractions. On the right side of this red border, we have the processes that power the machinery for muscle contractions. In other words, the process by which energy is provided for the machinery of muscle contractions. So this is exercise bioenergetics in a nutshell. Now, to provide a technical definition of bioenergetics, bioenergetics, sometimes referred to as energy metabolism, are the metabolic processes which include biochemical reactions that release energy from fuel and temporarily storing them in ATP, aka energy currency. Remember, energy is never created or destroyed, only released and transferred from one thing to another. So for example, from a fuel molecule to ATP. Now, a specific area of study of bioenergetics is exercise bioenergetics, which is the response in these bioenergetic systems to a situation in which there is an increase in ATP/energy demand in active tissues or cells, especially skeletal muscle, since it is the major expender of energy during exercise. Remember, energy is necessary to power the process of muscle contraction. So when you exercise, there will be an increase in energy and therefore ATP demand. And as we said in the previous slide, when ATP demand goes up, the bioenergetic systems respond by providing that ATP. Now, more specifically, however, when muscle activity/contractions increase, like during exercise, the rate of ATP demand increases, meaning the muscle cells need energy and thus ATP at a faster rate. Remember, rate is a certain quantity of something in relation to a unit of another thing, such as time. So for example, ATP per second. So in response to this increased rate of ATP demand, there is an increased rate in ATP production. So the takeaway here is that the level of muscle activity determines the rate of ATP demand, which determines the rate of ATP production. This here determines how active those bioenergetic systems are in taking energy from fuel molecules and using it to form ATP, which contains that energy for a temporary period of time. Now here we have some more key definitions that I want to discuss now before we get into the intricate details in the meat of this lecture. As I introduced in the start of this lecture, what is acute muscular fatigue? Acute muscular fatigue is a state in which muscle contractions and therefore force production is inhibited due to the presence of high metabolic stress caused by high to max intensity exercise. We will discuss what this metabolic stress is, but in essence, fatigue is a negative feedback mechanism to relieve the muscle and even the body from this metabolic stress. It is an acute stress response. So like I said in the beginning, fatigue is what you experience when you are, for example, sprinting and you slow down despite putting forth as much effort as possible. Something is inhibiting your muscles from contracting as hard as you want them to. This fatigue occurs because there is something stressful to the muscle when you are sprinting, and we will discuss again what that stress is. But for now, just know that this stress is harmful to the muscle, and thus the muscle is inhibiting itself to relieve itself from the stress. It pumps its own brakes. So let's put this into the context of, say, a VO2 max test. If you remember your exercise physiology lab, The subject performed the VO2 max test, which involved increasing running intensity, whether through increased speed or incline, at progressive stages. So after every stage, the subject would have to run at higher intensities. Now, in the beginning of the test, the running intensity was not difficult. It is something that the subject can sustain for a good period of time. In other words, they don't experience fatigue. And as each stage passes, the intensity increases. Now, if you remember, there was a stage in which the intensity started to become very difficult for the subject to sustain. There was an intensity where the subject, no matter how hard he or she was trying, it was becoming more difficult to sustain that intensity. In other words, something was inhibiting their muscles from working as hard as he or she wanted them to. This is the point where the muscles are experiencing this metabolic stress, and the stress response, which is the inhibition of the muscle, is now initiated. Then another stage passes and the intensity increases. At this point, the subject is experiencing more fatigue because there is more metabolic stress to the muscle. This inhibition of the muscle, i.e. fatigue, is becoming more severe, and it becomes more apparent that the muscle is trying to slow itself down. And exercising at this intensity is becoming harder and harder to sustain. This is what we are referring to when we are talking about fatigue. It is acute, meaning it is an immediate and temporary process. It is an immediate and temporary inhibition of muscle in response to a stressor that occurs with very high amounts of muscular work or exercise intensity. So now that we are clear as to what fatigue is, then what is the difference between fatigue and this term exhaustion? These two terms are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Exhaustion is referring to a situation in which muscle contractions are not necessarily inhibited, but rather impaired due to a lack of energy support. This is due to the depletion of energy substrates, aka fuel. So exhaustion is referring to fuel exhaustion or fuel depletion. The fuel necessary to provide the ATP and thus energy for muscle contractions have been exhausted or depleted. Since the major fuel for skeletal muscle contractions is muscle glycogen, which is a stored carbohydrate molecule, exhaustion is synonymous with the term muscle glycogen depletion. So as you can see, exhaustion and fatigue both result in decreased performance and reduced muscular force production, but it is due to different factors. Fatigue is due to an immediate and temporary inhibition of muscle contractions in response to a metabolic stress, while exhaustion is an impairment of muscle contractions due to the depletion of fuel. So if I ask the question, which of the following is responsible for the eventual decline in speed during a single all-out sprint effort, the answer would be fatigue, not exhaustion. If I ask which of the following is responsible for the eventual decline in muscular force production after 5 hours of steady state running, it would be exhaustion, fuel depletion. As you can see, fatigue is a matter of exercise intensity, while exhaustion is a matter of exercise duration. So please know the differences between fatigue and exhaustion, and especially understand the definition of fatigue, since that is the topic of discussion in this lecture series. Now, we will return to the topic of fatigue later on, but first we still need to go over basic information regarding bioenergetics. Again, this is the process by which fuel is broken down and the energy is released from the fuel molecules and transferred and held temporarily in the cell's energy currency, ATP. The ATP then can be split apart, releasing that energy for the muscle cells to use to power things like muscle contractions. Now in this figure, you will see an overview of the body's fuel sources that are used for ATP production. So let's start up here with food intake. Now the primary function of food is to provide the body with fuel in the form of energy-containing molecules called macronutrients. These are categorized into 3 types of fuel molecules: fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. Now in food, there are multiple types of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, but when it is introduced to the digestive system, they will all be broken down into its simplest form, or its building blocks, if you will. So fats will be broken down into its simplest form, which are called fatty acids. Carbohydrates will be broken down into its simplest form, which is primarily glucose, and proteins into its building blocks, which are amino acids. Now, these fatty acids, glucose, and amino acids are absorbed through your intestinal tract, and then they enter blood circulation. Then they get distributed throughout the body and can get taken up by various cells that can utilize it for fuel, such as muscle cells. Now, let's just say this third box here represents the muscle cell. Now, in your PowerPoints, you'll see arrows here, here, and here. Go ahead and ignore those. When fatty acids, glucose, or amino acids get taken up by cells, they enter the free pool of free fatty acids, glucose, and amino acids, respectively, inside the cell. Now, from here, the free fatty acids within this pool have one of two fates. They can be stored up in the form of a large fat store molecule called a triglyceride or triacylglycerol. And that process is generally described as anabolism. It's an anabolic process. Anabolism is the building of a larger molecule from smaller constituents. So anabolism of fats involves three free fatty acids combined together by a glycerol to form a large fat molecule, a triglyceride. The anabolism of fats, which again is the formation of a triglyceride from fatty acids, is referred to as lipogenesis. So fat anabolism is lipogenesis, the formation of triglyceride from three fatty acids combined by glycerol. Now, the other fate of fatty acids within this pool is that it can undergo oxidation. Now, oxidation is a process involving multiple biochemical reactions to break apart a fuel molecule like a fatty acid for the purpose of releasing its energy, transferring that energy, and holding that energy temporarily in the cell's energy currency, ATP. So free fatty acids can undergo fatty acid oxidation, and through that process, energy is released from that fatty acid and is temporarily held in the bonds of ATP, thus forming ATP. Now, when triglycerides that are stored in the muscle cell, for example, are broken down or catabolized, the fatty acids are freed and they enter the free fatty acid pool within the cell. This process is generally described as catabolism. Catabolism is the breakdown of larger molecules into smaller constituents, and catabolism of triglycerides is called lipolysis. Remember, lysis refers to catabolic reactions and lipo refers to fat. So lipolysis is the breakdown of triglyceride. And as a result, the three fatty acids within that triglyceride are freed up and they enter this free fatty acid pool. So what about carbohydrates? So glucose, just like the free fatty acids, they will be absorbed and circulated and can get taken up by cells like the muscle cell. The glucose, just like free fatty acids, has two fates after it enters the glucose pool within the muscle cell. A bunch of glucose can be bonded together to form glycogen, which is a larger carbohydrate molecule meant for storage. This is referred to as glycogenesis, formation of glycogen. And this, just like lipogenesis, is an anabolic process. So the anabolism of carbohydrates from glucose to glycogen is called glycogenesis. Now, the glucose can also undergo oxidation, just like the free fatty acids. This again is the process of breaking up the glucose molecule to release its energy to form ATP, which temporarily holds that energy in its bonds. Now, when the glycogen is broken up or catabolized to provide glucose to the muscle cell, this is a process called glycogenolysis, lysis of glycogen. Now, finally, we have the amino acids. Now, once the amino acids are absorbed and circulated, cells like the muscle cell can take them up. The amino acids can then enter the free amino acid pool inside the cell. Now from here, the amino acids can be used to build proteins in the cells, which is the primary function of amino acids. Proteins are essential for cellular function since there are so many different proteins that play a certain role inside the cell. For example, in muscle cells, there are proteins that are responsible for producing contractions like actin, myosin, tropomyosin, and so forth. Now, each individual protein is characterized by a unique amino acid sequence. So every protein has a different combination of amino acids. This unique combination determines what type of protein it is. So like actin has a different amino acid sequence than myosin and so forth. The process of building proteins from amino acids is of course an anabolic process and is simply referred to as protein synthesis. Now, the other fate of these free amino acids within this pool is oxidation for the purpose of producing ATP. However, as you can see here, it is not a preferred fuel molecule. And this is mainly because amino acids are needed to form proteins with, which have very important functions in cells. Now, glycogen and triglycerides only serve one purpose. It is to just exist as a fuel source. So proteins and its amino acids are used highly as a fuel during situations when there is a depletion of carbohydrates and fat stores, basically when the cell has no other option. Now, one unique aspect about amino acids is that amino acids called glucogenic amino acids can be used to form new glucose with. And this occurs primarily in the liver, not in the muscle cell. And this process is called gluconeogenesis, formation of new glucose. Now, when proteins are broken down, this is a catabolic process and is commonly referred to as protein degradation or protein breakdown. A more technical term is proteolysis, lysis of proteins. Okay, so this is a complete overview of fuel metabolism in the body, showing what specific fuel molecules are oxidized to release its energy to form ATP, which will hold that energy temporarily. So let's talk more about ATP in some good detail. Now, most of you are somewhat familiar with ATP and generally understand it as the cell's energy currency, all cells in the body, not just muscle cells. So when the cell needs energy to do something, it gets it from ATP. So for example, when the muscle cell wants to contract, it needs energy, and ATP is what provides it. Now in the human body, energy doesn't go directly from the fuel to the cellular component that needs it. The energy from the fuel is released and then temporarily contained within an intermediary fuel molecule called ATP, and it's contained only for a very brief period of time. So what is ATP and where is this energy contained? ATP, as most of you know, is adenosine triphosphate. Here we have an adenosine backbone made up of two molecules, adenine and a ribose sugar. Next, we know that triphosphate stands for 3 phosphate groups, or simply 3 phosphates. And that is what we have here. A phosphate or phosphate group is made up of a phosphorus, which is in the middle here, and 4 oxygens, which are bonded to the phosphorus, and you see that surrounding each of these phosphorus. This is together called a phosphate or a phosphate group. Now, these 3 phosphates are termed alpha, beta, and gamma phosphates. Remember that. Alpha, beta, and gamma phosphates. And they are all bonded together via phosphoanhydride bonds, or in simpler terms, phosphate bonds. Now, as you can see, we have one phosphoanhydride bond holding the gamma and the beta phosphates together, and we have another phosphoanhydride bond holding the beta and alpha phosphates together. Now, as you can see, these phosphoanhydride bonds, again simply called phosphate bonds, are described as high energy. Now, here's an important detail. These bonds contain high amounts of energy, but this does not mean that they are strong bonds. These are very weak and unstable bonds, meaning they do not last very long and can be broken up in a single quick reaction, which we'll discuss shortly. Now, the reason why these bonds are considered high energy is because it takes a lot of energy to maintain these bonds. I want you to think of these bonds as large compressed springs. We know that energy is required to keep the spring compressed and that the compressed spring has a lot of potential energy. And to harness that energy, you need to release the spring. So think of these bonds as those compressed springs. And these bonds are holding a lot of potential energy. Now the question before moving on is, where does this energy come from that are contained within these phosphate bonds? Remember the laws of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred from one thing to another. So as I introduced earlier in the recap of bioenergetics, the energy to form these phosphate bonds comes from fuel molecules, more specifically the oxidation of fuel molecules, the fats, carbs, and proteins, more specifically amino acids. This is how ATP is formed. So generally speaking, ATP is formed when you have an ADP, adenosine diphosphate with only two phosphates, and energy from a fuel molecule is used to form another phosphate bond, thus adding a third phosphate, creating ATP, triphosphate, which will now contain that energy in the phosphate bond for later use. So the next question is, how is the energy released from these phosphate bonds to power cellular processes such as muscle contractions? How do we release this quote-unquote compressed spring? So let's take a closer look at this process of splitting the phosphate bond to release the energy contained within it. Again, this process is referred to as ATP hydrolysis. Like I mentioned earlier, whenever you see the term end in lysis, it is a reaction that breaks apart a molecule. So ATP hydrolysis is the breaking apart of ATP. Hydro is referring to water, so we know water is somehow involved in the lysis of ATP. Now up here we have a more visual representation of ATP hydrolysis, and below we have a more formulated depiction. So first we have ATP. And as I said earlier, these phosphate bonds contain potential energy, like a compressed spring. This energy, again, came from a fuel source that was oxidized. And that energy that was released from those fuels is being used to hold these phosphate bonds together. Now let's put this into the context of muscle contraction. ATP attaches to the myosin head, and in order for the myosin to do work on that thin filament, it requires energy, and ATP is going to provide it. So as we said, the energy in ATP is released by splitting up these bonds. In this case, this last bond right here. Now to split this bond, we need two things. First, we need a water molecule, H2O. And then we need a catalyst. And as most of you know, in biochemical reactions, a catalyst is usually in the form of an enzyme protein. So the enzyme that catalyzes ATP hydrolysis is ATPase. Any term ending in ASE is an enzyme in biochemistry. So ATPase will catalyze this reaction where this phosphate bond is split open. And as a result of this reaction, the last phosphate is broken off because, again, the bond has been broken. Now, in so doing, you are left with an ADP with only two phosphates, and the phosphate that was just broken off is called an inorganic phosphate, which is symbolized as a P subscript I. Now, what happened to the water molecule? Now, this will be discussed in more detail in the next slide, but as you can see here, we have a positively charged hydrogen ion. And this is simply referred to as a proton. Why? Because we know that hydrogen, based on the periodic table of elements, is in position number 1, indicating that it has one proton. Now, if it was a neutral hydrogen with no charge on it, this would be one proton and one electron. If it was a negatively charged hydrogen ion, it would have one proton and more than one electron. If it is a positively charged hydrogen ion, as we see here, it would be one proton and 0 electrons. And this is why we just simply call a positively charged hydrogen ion a proton. So this proton came off of the water molecule. This proton plays a critical role in acute muscular fatigue, so we will come back to this later. For now, remember, this proton was derived from ATP hydrolysis and it came off of the water molecule. Now, what about the rest of the water molecule, the other hydrogen and the oxygen? As you see here, we have a oxygen plus hydrogen, also known as a hydroxyl group. You can see that it is bonded to the inorganic phosphate that was just split off from ATP. So in the next couple slides, we will discuss how all this happens in much more detail. Now, through this whole process, the energy that was contained in that phosphate bond was released, and this energy can then be used to power cross-burst cycling and thus muscle contractions. Okay, so in summary, ATP hydrolysis is the splitting of the last phosphate bond of ATP releasing its energy. Now to resynthesize ADP back to ATP, you need energy from a fuel molecule to be transferred to form a new phosphate bond on ADP, thus forming ATP. And this is what bioenergetic systems do. So please keep in mind, we are still on the refresher course for bioenergetics, and you will see why this is important for you to understand before delving into the science of acute muscular fatigue. So let's discuss ATP hydrolysis in even further detail. Okay, so here on the top left, we have an ATP molecule. We have an adenosine and 3 phosphates. And as I mentioned earlier, the energy is contained within these bonds between the phosphates. And these bonds are referred to as phosphoanhydride bonds, or simply phosphate bonds. Now it's depicted here using this figure of a battery. Think of ATP as a fully charged battery. Contained in those 2 phosphate bonds between the gamma and beta phosphates and the beta and alpha phosphates, we have about 50 kilojoules per mole total of energy within the ATP molecule. Now these phosphate bonds, although they are high energy, like I said, they are very weak and unstable. Again, it's kind of like a heavy spring that is compressed, and this is why ATP doesn't exist for very long. Once it is produced, it is almost immediately hydrolyzed. And because these bonds are weak and unstable, it doesn't take a lot of reactions to break it apart. In other words, ATP hydrolysis requires very little reactions. It only requires one reaction and one enzyme, as we discussed in the previous slide. So to reiterate, in order to utilize the energy contained within these phosphate bonds to power cellular processes such as muscle contractions, the energy must be released from these bonds via ATP hydrolysis. So how does ATP hydrolysis work? When ATP is hydrolyzed, the last phosphate bond is broken, and the energy contained in that last phosphate bond is released. Yes, you can hydrolyze ADP as well, but for now, let's just talk about ATP hydrolysis. So as we indicated in the last slide, ATP hydrolysis requires a reaction with a water molecule, H2O, and that is shown right here. Now let's take a closer look at this water molecule. The oxygen atom on H2O contains 2 lone electron pairs, and that is indicated here by these 4 dots. You have 1 electron pair here and another electron pair here. They are considered lone electron pairs because these electron pairs are not used to form a bond with anything in the water molecule. The electron pairs here and here are used to form a bond with hydrogen. Now, lone electron pairs are highly reactive, meaning they want to form a bond with something. And that something in this case is ATP, more specifically with this gamma phosphate, and even more specifically with the phosphorus of this gamma phosphate. So the way hydrolysis works is that this water molecule, more specifically the lone electron pairs on the oxygen, needs to perform what we call a nucleophilic attack on the phosphorus of the gamma phosphate group. I'll say that again. The lone electron pairs on the oxygen needs to perform a nucleophilic attack on the phosphorus of the gamma phosphate group. A nucleophilic attack results in a new bond between the gamma phosphate and the water molecule. And through this process, the phosphate bond between the gamma and beta phosphates is broken. And as a result, energy contained within that phosphate bond is released. As an analogy, the compressed spring is released, and that potential energy within the compressed spring is released. Now, as we said before, in order for any reaction like this to take place, there needs to be an enzyme. And the enzyme that catalyzes ATP hydrolysis is, again, ATPase. So how does ATPase work, and how does it catalyze hydrolysis? So let's turn our attention to this figure down here to the right. On the y-axis, you have a measure of free energy called Gibbs free energy, which is abbreviated by the capital letter G. So this point here is 50 kilojoules per mole, which is the amount of energy contained in ATP within those phosphate bonds. This is the full battery. Now, the point of ATP hydrolysis is to drain the battery to some extent by releasing the energy in that last phosphate bond through the nucleophilic attack. But here's the thing. The nucleophilic attack actually requires a bit of energy. Let's focus on the red line right here. As you can see, the red line increases for a brief period, meaning there is energy input required. This represents the fact that before energy can be released from ATP, there is a need for additional energy to get the hydrolysis, more specifically the nucleophilic attack, started. So why does the nucleophilic attack cost energy? Well, it has to do with the difference in electrical charge. You see, the lone pair of electrons, as you see here on the oxygen of H2O, is negatively charged. They are electrons. The phosphate on ATP, more specifically this gamma phosphate, has an overall negative charge as well. In particular, the oxygens on the phosphate have a negative charge, as you can see by these symbols next to the oxygen. What we all should generally know by now is that negative and negative charges do not attract, they repel. So naturally, the water molecule and the ATP repel one another due to the negative charges on both ends. So this is why it takes a bit of energy to get the water molecule close enough to the ATP so that the lone pairs of electrons on the oxygen can perform the nucleophilic attack on the phosphorus on the gamma phosphate. This is kind of like you taking a negative end of a magnet and trying to get it close to the negative end of another magnet. You know it's going to require some energy to do this. So where does the enzyme ATPase come into play? What ATPase does is make the nucleophilic attack much more energy efficient. What it does is it lowers the energy and thus quote-unquote effort required for the water molecule to react with the phosphate. How does it do this? Now, ATPase is an enzyme that can sort of wrap itself around the ATP molecule. Now, ATPase has an overall positive charge. I'll say that again. ATPase has an overall positive charge, and thus by wrapping itself around ATP, it makes ATP less negative. And thus there is less natural repulsion between the lone electron pairs on the water molecule and the gamma phosphate. Thus less energy is required initially to perform the nucleophilic attack when ATPase is present. And that is represented here by the blue line. You can see that the initial energy requirement for ATP hydrolysis is lower with ATPase activity. So again, the ATPase essentially lowers the initial energy required for the nucleophilic attack and thus hydrolysis. It makes the ATP less negative so that the water molecule is less repulsed from ATP. Now, at this point right here, below the 50 kilojoule per mole line, we see then a drop in energy in ATP. And this is when the nucleophilic attack is completed and thus hydrolysis occurs. This is the point where the phosphate bond is broken and the energy within that bond is released. So this represents the energy that was released from that last phosphate bond upon the nucleophilic attack and hydrolysis. Now, in that phosphate bond between the gamma and beta phosphate, there is about 30 kilojoules per mole of energy. So upon hydrolysis of ATP, about 30 kilojoules per mole of energy is drained from the ATP. And that 30 kilojoules per mole is used to power cellular processes like, again, cross-bridge cycling for muscle contractions. So as you can see, the battery upon that nucleophilic attack and thus hydrolysis is drained about 30 kilojoules per mole. This was the amount of energy that was contained and subsequently released from that last phosphate bond. And again, that energy that was released is then used to power cellular processes like cross-bridge cycling for muscle contractions. Now on the left, you will see the results of ATP hydrolysis. So after the nucleophilic attack, the gamma phosphate is now broken off since the water molecule replaced that phosphate bond between the gamma and the beta phosphates. This is referred to now as an inorganic phosphate, or P subscript I. Please remember this, as this inorganic phosphate is involved in acute muscular fatigue, which we'll talk about later. Now here you can see that one oxygen and one hydrogen from the water molecule, also known as a hydroxyl group, is attached to this free phosphate. And you can also see that one of the hydrogens from the water molecule was freed, and that is shown here as a positively charged hydrogen ion, or in other words, again, as I said before, a proton. And like I also said before, please remember this proton and where it came from, because this proton is implicated in the process of acute muscular fatigue. So at the end of ATP hydrolysis, you are left with an inorganic phosphate and a free proton, both of which, as I said, are implicated in acute muscular fatigue. More on this later. Okay, lastly, going back to this figure here, remember, ATPase is an enzyme that facilitates the nucleophilic attack by making the ATP less negative and thus less repulsive to the lone electron pairs on the water molecule. So ATPase is obviously very important to facilitate ATP hydrolysis and energy release from ATP. So it would be logical to suggest that with greater ATPase levels inside the muscle cells and thus ATPase activity, ATP hydrolysis and thus energy release would be much more efficient. And this is definitely the case. With more ATPase activity in the muscle, the more efficient ATP hydrolysis is on that myosin head, and thus there is more quote-unquote power provided for cross-burst cycling and muscle contractions. How do you think this would translate to muscle force production and exercise performance? It would be favorable. Now, generally speaking, which muscle fiber type has greater contractile force production and also greater contractile speed? If you remember from our exercise physiology course, you will remember that the type 2 muscle fibers, more so the type 2X muscle fibers, have the greatest contractile force and speed. And one of the factors that contribute to this characteristic of type 2 fibers compared to type 1 is that they have much more ATPase levels and ATPase activity. Meaning, in type 2 fibers, more so type 2X fibers, the nucleophilic attack and therefore hydrolysis is much more efficient, thereby making cross-bridge cycling and thus muscle contractions more forceful and faster. Now, to visualize this whole process in the context of muscle contractions, here we have ATP on that myosin head. We need to transfer the energy from the ATP within that last phosphate bond to the myosin head, so the myosin can perform work on the thin filament. So ATP will undergo ATP hydrolysis, which involves a water molecule, more specifically the lone electron pairs on the oxygen of the water molecule, performing a nucleophilic attack on the last phosphate of ATP. Through that process, the water molecule creates a new bond with the gamma, or the last phosphate, which in turn breaks up the phosphate bond. At this point, about 30 kilojoules per mole of energy is released from that phosphate bond and transferred to the myosin head. This would put the myosin head in a high energy configuration. As you can see, as a result of hydrolysis, the ATP is now split to ADP and an inorganic phosphate, which is attached to the hydroxyl group from the water molecule. Also, what is left but not shown here is the proton, which is the positive hydrogen ion which came off of the water molecule. Now, because the myosin has energy now, it can perform work on the actin filament. It can attach to it and slide it across, thus producing the effect we see right here in this animation, the sliding filament process, which will cause the muscle to contract.